The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 5, Dragon and Judge. Chapter 24. For a long minute, Allison just stood there, staring at the closed door, her mind skidding like an out-of-control bobsled. One way or another, she was going to die tonight. Tanim bounded out of her back collar. The sudden weight threw Allison off balance, and she barely caught herself before she could slam into the wall.
I'm sorry.
Tanim apologized as she turned back around.
I came off too quickly.
No, it's okay, Allison said, looking at the Gaddah with a surge of guilt. Take care of Tanim, Jack had told her just before he disappeared on Semaline. Instead, Allison's failure was going to get her killed too.
Are you worried?
Tanim asked, stepping closer and peering into Allison's face. Yes, I'm worried, Allison told her honestly. In fact, I'm terrified. The dragon twitched her tail.
How may I help?
Allison sighed as she sat down on the edge of her bed. I don't think you can, she said.
You will solve the problem,
Tanim said firmly.
I know you will.
Tanim looked away from that earnest dragon face. I don't think so, she said quietly. I'm stuck, Tanim. I can't figure out what the people who designed the safe were trying to do. She started as something settled onto her lap. She looked down to see Tanim's head resting there, those silver eyes gazing up at her. It was so exactly like the way her old Newfoundland used to do that it brought tears to her eyes.
You're very clever, Allison,
Tanim said.
I've heard both Jack and Draco say so.
Allison had to smile at that. Jack actually paid me a compliment? Tanim's tail flicked.
I'm not sure he meant it as a compliment,
She conceded.
I think he was being annoyed with you at the time.
That sounds better, Allison said. Her smile faded. But all that cleverness doesn't seem to be working. You were right. We should have tried to get away back on Semaline.
No, it was you who were right,
Tanim insisted.
The risk was worth taking. As you pointed out, if we'd attacked our captors, we might well have died.
Instead of dying now, Allison said, stroking Tanim's head. At least you they won't have to worry about burying. And was instantly ashamed of herself. It had been horribly insensitive to remind Tanim that she would go two-dimensional and simply disappear when she died. She opened her mouth to apologize, the words frozen in her throat. Would simply disappear? And suddenly she had it. That's it, she murmured. Tanim, I've got it.
I knew you would,
Gaddah said, lifting her head from Allison's lap.
Tell me.
They were smart, Allison said, her whole body feeling limp with relief. They were very smart. You know anything about fingerprints and retina patterns? Well, no, probably you don't.
Were those some of the tests the doctor performed when we first arrived?
Tanim asked. Yes, right, Allison confirmed. She'd forgotten Tanim had been there for that. Which was a strange thought all by itself. Was she really getting so comfortable with Tanim's presence that she could actually forget that Gaddah was there against her skin? Anyway, fingerprints and those other things are sometimes used like keys to make sure the wrong people can't open a door or safe or something, she said, getting back to her explanation. That's what those indentions on the side of the safe are for. One of the crew puts their fingers into the right holes. That triggers some sensors, and then you can open the safe without the bomb going off and destroying everything inside. Tanim pondered that a moment.
So the reason the other two safes were destroyed was that the people didn't know which indentions to use?
Partly, Allison said, but mostly they didn't have the right fingers. Tanim cocked her head.
I don't understand.
See, the problem with this kind of lock is that sometimes they can be fooled, Allison told her. All a bad person has to do is kill someone who has access and then take his fingers or his eyes. Tanim's neck arched.
That's barbaric!
I agree, Allison said, though it's actually a little more complicated these days. The point is that the safe's designers didn't want that happening here. She smiled grimly. So whose digits do you suppose they keyed the lock for? Tanim's jaws cracked open in a wide smile.
They keyed it for Kadatos!
Exactly, Allison said, nodding. Add in the fact that you need a Kada-Shantine combination in order to look over the wall and figure out which indentions to use, and you can see that Neverland and the Valaga pretty well shot themselves in the foot when they wiped out Dracos' team.
Only they didn't know it,
Tanim said thoughtfully.
What then do we do?
We open their safe for them, Allison said, standing up and holding out her hand. Come on, let's get some lunch. Then we'll show them how a real safecracker does things. Frost had apparently expected Allison to stall as long as she could. As a result, he was the last to arrive when the group gathered again in the Patry suite after lunch.
Good of you to join us, Colonel,
Neverland said with an edge of sarcasm as Frost slipped into the room.
Allison says she's ready. Does she?
Frost said, giving Allison a long, hard look as he crossed to his usual seat. Yes, she does, Allison said. Or were you expecting her to wait until a little closer to your deadline? Neverland frowned.
Deadline?
Colonel Frost told me before lunch that I had until midnight tonight to get the safe open, Allison explained. Neverland turned an unreadable expression on Frost.
Or,
he prompted.
The Patry Chukuk was right. She was stalling,
Frost said before Allison could answer.
Now I thought she could use a little extra incentive.
And as you see, it worked, said Allison, watching Neverland closely. You ought to let the Colonel take charge more often.
We'll certainly consider it,
Neverland said coolly as he turned back to Allison.
And we're waiting.
Allison nodded and turned back to the safe. That had been risky, she knew, but the more she could create or encourage strains between Neverland and his allies, the better. Kneeling down in front of the safe, she stretched out her left arm along the line of indentions, resting her palm on top of numbers 4 and 6. I hope someone's got my money ready, she commented as she got a grip on the combination dial. And as she did so, she felt a whisper of weight come onto her palm as Tanim lifted her forepaw from Allison's hand and slid 2 of her toes into the proper indentions. Allison keyed the combination she'd worked out. There was a soft snick from somewhere inside the safe. Praying that she'd gotten everything right, she took hold of the brake bar and pulled. Without any fuss or muss, or smoke or explosions, the door swung open. Neverland and Frost were there in an instant, Frost shoving Allison aside in his eagerness. Fortunately, Tanim was able to get her toes out of sight before Allison's hand was pushed away from the safe wall. Hey! Allison protested as she lost her balance and landed flat on her rear. Both men ignored her.
Well,
the Patry rumbled from his chair.
They're here,
Neverland said, his voice almost shaking with excitement. He pulled his cupped hands out of the safe, full of the little diamonds Tanim had described.
And not burned to ashes.
The Patry gestured to one of the Brumgas standing guard by the door.
Order that its money is to be prepared,
he said.
Order, too, that a transport be made ready. Let's not be too hasty,
Frost cautioned, peering down at the diamonds.
This is from the one that crashed, remember? I think we should make sure the data's intact before we turn her loose.
He's right,
Neverland seconded.
I'm sure she won't mind hanging around another day or so.
He sent Allison a cultured sort of smirk.
After all, she's the one who suggested we should listen to the Colonel more often.
Carefully, Allison suppressed a smile. She'd been afraid she would have to find a way to make that suggestion herself. Not a problem, she assured them. Just remember that another job will cost another 20,000.
Understood, Neverland said. Colonel, would you escort Miss Kana back to her room?
I'll have Dumbarton and Mershpaw do it,
Frost said.
I think I'd better stay and help you check this out.
For a long moment, the two men gazed at each other.
Whatever you'd like, Neverland said at last. Miss Kana, we'll see you later.
The afternoon dragged by. Allison spent the entire time alone in her room, wondering each minute if someone was about to arrive, hand her 20,000, and escort her out the gate, kicking her off the Chakuk estate before she and Tanim had a chance to find and open the other safe. But no one came. Shufti Lee arrived with her dinner at the usual time, with his usual polite but somewhat distant attitude. Allison and Tanim ate, then settled in for an evening that promised to be as long and nerve-wracking as the afternoon had been. Again, no one had arrived by the time the lights out warning tone came over the room's intercom. Allison was already in bed by then, getting in a little pre-bedtime doze in anticipation of a sleepless night ahead. Once the house was quiet, she and Tanim would go in search of that final safe. And they would succeed. Allison had no doubt about that. Not anymore. Tanim's quiet faith, plus the afternoon's triumph, had blown away her earlier crisis of confidence like mist in a windstorm. It was an hour after lights out, and the slave areas around had gone quiet, when she heard the sound of her door being quietly opened.
Kana,
Dumbarton's voice called softly. Who is it? Allison asked, slurring her words slightly as if she'd been startled out of her sleep.
Dumbarton and Mershpaw,
Dumbarton said.
Come on, Mr. Arthur wants to see you.
Allison winced. They weren't going to throw her out now, were they? What about? She asked, throwing off her covers and pulling on her shoes.
You always go to bed with all your clothes on?
Dumbarton asked suspiciously. Hardly ever, Allison said, standing up. I was resting and fell asleep.
Sure, Dumbarton said. Quiet now.
They headed up to the slave areas, crossed the deserted kitchen, and emerged into the starlight through the same door Allison had used on her own midnight trip a few nights previously. But it wasn't Neverland who was waiting for her in the darkness. It was Frost.
There you are,
he greeted her in a low voice.
Good news. The data diamonds gave us everything we needed to know.
Glad to hear it, Allison said, the skin on the back of her neck starting to tingle. Where's my money?
Where you'll never see it.
Frost jerked his head toward an open-topped car waiting a few feet away.
Take her to the slave area,
he ordered the two mercenaries.
And kill her.